And October 11th, 1987 was the second March on Washington. This was after AIDS was going on. And October 11th ultimately became Coming Out Day. That was how Coming Out Day got started. This was the second national March on Washington for LGBT people. And it was the first public display of the names quilt. We've come a tremendous way. Much as I complain about some things, we have made strides. And there was a silver lining to AIDS in that people who were prominent did end up being either outed or coming out.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are on your journey, I hope this podcast will help you feel less alone. Today's guest, Dr. Larry Millhoffer, is a retired physician from Connecticut. He shares his story of taking care of people with AIDS in the early 1980s and reminds us of the discrimination faced by patients and even by their families. Before I share today's interview, I want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com, and you can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app. In Apple Podcasts, it's now Follow. You can also get show notes automatically via our newsletter. Just go to the link in the show notes that appear in your podcasting app or text Graying Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. Spell Graying Rainbows with an A. I would love to hear from you. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. We also have a fan page on Facebook, and we're at Graying R on Twitter. Graying Rainbows has a private group on MeWe, which I'll tell you more about after the interview. Larry, it's great to have you on Graying Rainbows today. How are you doing?
Fine. It's my pleasure to be with you finally.
So the reason I wanted to have you on the show is because even though you've been out a long time, that's actually a good thing because you can give us a perspective on how the journey has, evolved over these many years. So would you like to go back to the beginning of your story and maybe share some with us?
Okay. So I was born in 49. I'm 71 now. I think I first became aware that I was interested in men a bit like maybe early teens, but I was sort of late to really completely realize that. Late to mature, I guess I should say. I was in Boy Scouts was the first I heard of like masturbation. And ironically, our scoutmaster turned out to be homosexual. I guess he was actually, you'd have to say in a few, I'm sort of reluctant to call him a pederast but you'd hear things like there were a couple of scouts that would share his sleeping bag and things like that. And he would, when we'd have showers as a group, like at a scout camp, he would be the one handing out towels to the other scouts. And I didn't think about that at the time, really. But ultimately, he was revealed as this, quote, homosexual. And my parents actually took me aside. And my mother, actually, my father was, he was a little hands off on sexuality issues, actually. And my mother said, oh, he was a homosexual and she treated it as a sickness, basically, that it was something that she didn't treat it as a criminal act, more as a sickness sort of issue. And it's the first time I'd heard those terms. And of course, you go to a public library, you couldn't really find out a lot of the books on sexuality, what ones that were in a restricted section unless you were a certain age, and it was a whole different era, and there was very little you could find about that. You could look it up in a dictionary and get a very basic definition. And I thought at the time that, I have some interest in men too, and so maybe that's what I'm going to be. But I didn't really feel, and I was raised Catholic, and that, fortunately, I'd already decided that I wasn't a religious person because we went to parochial schools actually the first few years, and then they opened a public elementary school in our neighborhood, and we switched to that when I was in fourth grade, I guess. I was the oldest of 5 kids. And I had question religion because you'd get these, well, what's this about? And you'd get these, oh, you have to accept that on faith responses. And so I had become disenchanted with the Catholic Church, even at a fairly early age. And so ultimately, by the time I got ready to apply to colleges, and I was still didn't know at that time any other gay people. There was someone I suspected in my high school who was in my homeroom that was a bit effeminate that I thought, oh, that's probably a gay person, but it didn't, I didn't share anything about that. Oh, and when I was, one of my playmates in my early teens was another boy in the neighborhood who had somewhat effeminate mannerisms, and my mom discouraged me from playing with him because of that. In retrospect, I hadn't really thought about it too much at the time, but I think that was why, actually. We were both in the same high school class that he did turn out to be gay, and we met when we were living on the Cape and had some interesting stories about our high school perceptions. We were very different perceptions of what our high school was like, which was a public high school. And as I say, I didn't really know anybody who was openly gay there. And people didn't tend to come out at that age in those days, back 60s. So I graduated from high school in 67.
Were they using the term gay at that point?
Gee, I don't recall. Because again, there was so little written. You couldn't really, it was hard to find anything that talked about homosexuality, even after this thing about the Scoutmaster. And I'm not sure, it must have happened either in junior high or the beginning of high school when that came up. But that was about the only thing. I hadn't had any sexual experiences myself. I knew that I was sort of interested. And actually, a friend, I ended up going to an all-male college, Haverford College near Philadelphia. And I read a lot into the fact that it was an all-male college and that it was near the city of brotherly love, for what's that worth. It shows how naive I was in some ways. And it was a small college, so only our freshman class was like about 100 and some students. No, more than that, maybe 200 or 300, maybe 200 at the time. And at that point, again, it was still all male, although they had dorm exchange with Bryn Mawr, which was our sister college down near Philadelphia. I fully expected to go there and to come out, to meet other gay people, at least other male students who were interested in other male students. And I went through my whole freshman year and didn't meet anybody that was obviously gay. And I was pretty frustrated because I was ready to come out physically, at least, or to have a sexual experience. And there wasn't, and it's an all residential school. They had basically everyone lived on campus. And so I thought it would be a hotbed. So finally, in my sophomore year, I ended up going down. You would take the train, it was on the main line into Philadelphia, and was wandering around the downtown streets a bit. And someone cruised me in front of Wanamaker's, which was a big department store, and we ended up having sex in his car. So that was my coming out experience. But and of course, the drinking age was 21 in Pennsylvania. It was 18 in New York. And I looked young for my age in those days before I went prematurely gray. So you couldn't even go out to a bar or something. There was really not, and to take the train into Philadelphia, it was very cumbersome. So I was pretty frustrated in that sense. And there finally were, like, if you went into the library at our college, there really weren't any good books at that time about homosexuality or sexual stuff. Finally, I think Martin Weinberg published a book while I was still in college, Society and the Healthy Homosexual, which was the first positive thing I read about it. And the movie Boys in the Band came out, which I was sort of thrilled by at the time, even though obviously it wasn't the most positive look at gay society as such, but at least it was something that was more out there in the public purview. So it was really a time of very limited, and we didn't have the internet availability of less biased stuff on gays. And as far as gay literature, there were a couple popular books that were sort of more mainstream, or at least you could find them in regular bookstores, like The Lord Won't Mind by Gordon Merrick and Mary Renault's Greek novels she wrote that were at least more positive and dealt with homosexuality, somewhat at least had homosexual characters. So it was hard to get a very positive view of that. I thought I was missing out on part of my college experience. Stonewall happened, of course, revolutionized at least got gays into the public newspapers in 69. I went to college 67, graduated in 71. So that was a big event. It did appear in the mainstream newspapers, and I think Time and Life magazine even had a couple spreads that dealt with homosexuals, but they always focused on the flamboyant, more dramatic examples. So it wasn't really, I even went to see a counselor at the college in probably either my junior or senior year and talk about it because I was, as I say, pretty frustrated. And he encouraged me finally, I think in my senior year, to write a letter to the student newspaper talking about it, although I did that anonymously. And it did create some feedback in the newspaper a little bit, but basically it didn't cause anybody to out themselves publicly. And Bryn Mawr had more of a reputation as having a lot of lesbians there, but certainly Haverford did not have that reputation. And I'm sure there had to be. And ultimately, I learned that actually one of my roommates in my senior year turned out to be gay. But what happened is he was from a local town, Havertown, and he had a friend visit him on campus who was obviously, I thought, gay. And then when I finally was old enough to go to a gay bar in my senior year downtown Philadelphia, I ran into this friend of his, just talk about small world. And he said, "Oh, you have to tell Stan that you're gay because he's having a lot of trouble dealing with this." And so just before Christmas break, I approached this room. I was in a 6-man suite at that time, and we each had our own individual bedrooms. And then there was a joint shower and living room area. Everyone ate in the campus dining center. We didn't have dining rooms in our individual dorms, sort of thing. So I approached Stan and said, I ran into your friend Steve in downtown Philadelphia the other day, and he told me to tell you that I'm gay. And he just about fell over. And they said, "I can't discuss it." And then we left on our Christmas break. And when I came back after, he thought about it for a while. He said, "Yeah, it's nice of you to tell me, but I really not comfortable discussing that or being out to anybody." So that was really the closest I got to really sharing that in college. And so I'd gotten into University of Buffalo Medical School, and I thought, and I had, by the way, I had met someone in a Philadelphia train station of all places. But that's one of the few places that you could publicly cruise and meet people if you couldn't go to the bars. My senior year, who was a teacher, actually. He was, I'd say, a couple of years older than I was anyway, maybe 4 or 5. And he was a teacher. I think he taught disabled kids. We ended up having a relationship, and I spent a lot of nights off campus sleeping at he had an apartment, and he had his own VW Bug. And I really became quite close to him. We both sort of treated it as we knew it was sort of, I'd be graduating in May, and he was going to actually go to Russia for some sort of scholarship or grant he had to do some research there. I'm not sure how that tied in with his working with disabled kids, but anyway, that was his plan. So we knew it couldn't be a long-term relationship, but we were actually quite close to each other. And it was the first positive relationship I'd had with someone who was gay. The other people I had met were all like one night stands, or not even that, just, meeting, cruising at a train station, maybe going to somewhere to have just a brief encounter. So that was the first positive relationship experience I had as a gay person. And still what you would see in the media, or what you could even find to read, wasn't very positive. And it made me think, what sort of positive life can I have as a gay person? And then, of course, I was going to be in medical school. And I actually come from a big family. I have 4 brothers and sisters. And I was thinking, well, I'd sort of be interested in pediatrics. But then I thought, there's no way that a gay person should become a pediatrician. There are too many restrictions. It would be really a huge hassle. So when I went off to medical school, and then I was planning to have my own apartment at medical school, or they didn't really have campus housing for medical students or graduate students for the most part. And a fellow had contacted me who was also going to be a first-year student at the medical school, who was a neighbor of my cousins in Rochester. I come from Rochester, New York, originally, from a suburb and different suburb. But he said, "Oh, Chris said you'd be a great roommate and that I should contact you and we could become roommates in medical school." I thought, oh, here's a I assumed a straight person, another student who knew my cousin who wanted to be roommates. And I thought, wow, do I want to get tied up in this? But it made sense economically for us to look for an apartment together, etc. So I said, okay, and we did that. And we found this apartment that was, I had a car and he didn't. I'd gotten a car for graduation from my aunt, who was very kind to me in many ways. My mother had died in high school, and she was like a second mother to us, and she never had kids, and she sent us to summer camp and did certain things that we couldn't afford to do. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My father was a machine operator for Kodak, which is a big, was a non-unionized, but the biggest employer in Rochester. My mother was the reader and the one who, neither of them went to college. Of course, they grew up in the Depression. My father helped support his parents, where his father was out of work, and he had 3 sisters and helped support them, and just wasn't a good time for either of them to go to college, and they didn't. And so I was going to be the first one in the family to go to college and then medical school and everything. But my mom was the intellectual, the reader and everything. And she was the one who had the discussion about this homosexual scoutmaster. And my dad was just sort of, we never talked to him too much. He'd come home from work, eat, and fall asleep in his chair watching TV. And that was it, sort of. He didn't read. I guess he read the newspaper in a sort of desultory fashion, but he wasn't a person we talked to. And then after my mom died in high school, breast cancer, the 5 of us kids, we would talk among ourselves, not about sexuality, but my dad sort of felt out of the loop because he had never developed these channels of communication, and it was a little late in some ways. And he was very devout Catholic. He had survived World War II. He was a master sergeant, but was in the invasion of Sicily and Normandy, and had been in Africa, and had survived all that. And he felt it was because God kept him alive, basically. And he was a very devout Catholic, whereas my mother they'd both gone to Catholic high schools and Catholic schools as they grew up. And she was more questioning in many ways. And she was the one, he would have preferred us to stay in Catholic schools when they opened this public elementary school near us, but she wanted us to go to the public school. And then sure, one day we could go to religious ed at the Catholic school. But she was much more questioning, which I didn't quite perceive until when the gay issue came up when I was in college with my dad at one point, because I'd gone out and stayed out overnight in Rochester during the summer vacation. He said, well, your mom always, he wasn't too surprised, actually, but he treated it as don't tell the relatives. If you get put in jail, I'll bail you out. Sort of, that was his approach to it. He just really, I was family, of course, but he wasn't comfortable with the whole thing. So anyway, I ended up in Buffalo for medical school, and they had a Mattachine Society had a group there, and they actually sponsored dances. Although basically I had my own car, so I was able to go to the gay bars at that point and met more educated people in the gay community and felt I was quite comfortable with being gay. My roommate, the first year we were together there, who was straight. He was a good guy, and I came out to my first year, and then I felt sorry for him because I was going out and meeting all these people, and he was stuck at home. We were both medical students, so we did have a fair workload and everything, but he had 2 girlfriends that he had still had from college that both of them came to visit over time, but lived in other states. So he was sort of didn't have much of a sexual outlet or sex life. And I really felt sorry for him that I felt he didn't have much of a life other than school at that point. But so I became very positive about the gay lifestyle to a second. But there was still not that much out there as far as positive books. People were starting to write things. There still wasn't an internet. And I didn't know anybody who was gay. Interestingly, one of his closest friends in our medical school class was from New York and was very flamboyant and a bit effeminate, but married. And Alan said, "Oh, this friend, turns out several years later that yes, this friend was gay, and he ultimately came out. But again, that's another whole story. So I went through medical school realizing that I'd have to be careful. Even the year that I was applying for internships and residencies, I asked someone on the faculty, actually, that I felt I could trust, well, what do you think it would be a problem if they knew I was gay if I applying? But, oh, don't divulge that. It definitely, they knew people who'd been discriminated against, et cetera, et cetera. And so I ended up applying to a non-university program, St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco, which was a Catholic hospital, but someone on our faculty was a good friend of the people there. And you could spend a month of going elsewhere. And I spent a month of October in San Francisco interviewing at several hospitals there, as well as having a month off. And it turned out October is the best month to go to San Francisco because the weather is great. I'd heard San Francisco was very gay friendly, but I didn't know much else about California. And of course, I'd never been to California. And wow, I mean, you could walk down the street and you'd be cruised by men, which was a totally new experience. It was just like, wow, this is a gay paradise. And the weather part, I'd never been in California, but it was a very attractive city. It's a beautiful city. And so I was very eager and I was accepted it was my first choice, St. Mary's there in San Francisco in the match program. And so I ended up going there. And I had to drive across country. I drove across country with my sister and my little Datsun, and it made it over the mountains. I wasn't sure it would, but it did. And having manual transmission in San Francisco with all those hills is you got to be a pretty good driver. And then my internship year, I met my current partner, who'd been together 45 years now. And he was convalescing a bit he'd had an auto accident where he'd been thrown out of the vehicle and dislocated his hip. And then he got a foot drop from that on his left leg and was on crutches. He was off the crutches when I met him, but he had been fixing up properties with his former partner at first, and then on his own somewhat. And he has a degree in landscape architecture, but he'd been doing mainly personnel management and different things like that. And I didn't realize he was 10 years older at the time, or I probably would have been hesitant about the relationship. So we actually met in one of these gay bars during the day. And I said, "You want to go home?" He said, "Oh, no, I'm here consoling this friend of his who had some issue going on." And so we exchanged phone numbers, and I tried calling him and it wasn't a working number. I thought, oh, another one of these. And then a day or two later, he called me and I said, "Well, that number you gave me didn't work." And it turned out it wasn't. He'd written it down. One digit was wrong. And then we got together and then developed a relationship ultimately. Over the next few months, we ended up moving out of my apartment on my own. He had a place on his own, moved into an apartment together, and been together ever since. And then the other issue is, so we're in San Francisco. I did my internship and residency. And frankly, at that time, this was in the 70s. So I finished my residency in 78, May of 78. And he was from Connecticut originally. And at that time, this is a little pre-AIDS. AIDS hadn't really come out to the early 80s. I mean, I don't know when the first patient was diagnosed, but I think it was in the early 80s. And frankly, there had been one book written by actually a San Francisco gay physician about STDs and gay men. The whole book was about STDs and gay men. And I had read that. And frankly, I thought if I stayed in San Francisco and opened a practice, I didn't want a gay practice. It would be all STDs. And I liked seniors. I had a very close relationship with my grandmother. And I really wanted to do primary care medicine, but not have a gay practice because I thought it would be boring. STD. So I didn't want to be that. That wasn't my interest in infectious disease. And this was aside from in San Francisco, it's a very desirable place. And unless you join someone's practice, it would be hard to get started because it was even in those days somewhat expensive. And unless you had a specialty. So yeah, I could have had a gay practice, but I didn't want a gay practice, not because of internalized homophobia, but just because I didn't think it would be the sort of medicine I wanted to practice. So that was because the one physician who'd written this book and all had a gay practice, for instance, so there certainly were gay physicians. I'd met a couple while I was in training out there, but I decided to look at Connecticut because that's where Alan was from. And so we came here and I looked around, and sure enough, Eastern Connecticut, where he was from, was, again, there were two small smaller community hospitals in this county he was from. And I looked at both of them and decided that there also was the Coast Guard Academy. And I actually interviewed with someone from there, but I decided, no, I didn't want to, because I didn't feel I could be openly gay as a physician at the Coast Guard Academy. And so I decided to open my own practice. And that's what I did at one of the community hospitals, which was probably 160 beds or so. The town of Norwich, where the hospital was, probably 30-some thousand people. It was considered thickly settled rural. There were these two community hospitals, and the closest university hospital was Yale in New Haven, and that was it. There was a couple of big hospitals in the Hartford area, but there wasn't a medical school at that time up there. So I opened the doors to my own practice. Now, most internists, I was an internist, and were in coverage groups. They would have solo practices, or maybe sometimes two would be together, but they would be in joint coverage groups. And that's what I ended up joining a coverage group with two other internists. And we each had our own solo practices, but we had this joint coverage group. And we didn't really, I didn't say I'm a gay physician because I wasn't expecting to have a gay practice as such. And Alan's sister had little young kids, 3 daughters, and she was just getting ready to enter the workforce. So she was my first. I opened a practice, solo practice with 2 examining rooms. Alan's sister is my receptionist and me, and joined this coverage group. And that went along for several years. We had built a house in adjacent town, which was in the catchment area for both of these community hospitals, but it was like a 15, 20-minute drive to the hospital. And it's funny, it never was discussed explicitly that I was gay, but they knew, my coverage group knew I was living with this other man. And I guess they didn't have us over dinner. We didn't have them over to dinner, but we got along from a medical standpoint and covering each other's patients, and it wasn't an issue.
I want to take a moment to thank those of you who have taken the time to email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Your feedback keeps me going, and it's also the main reason why this show has evolved into its current form, with an emphasis on sharing our personal stories. I also want to thank those of you who support the show financially via Patreon. If you're interested in helping offset the costs of producing Graying Rainbows, just go to patreon.com/graying rainbows. Spell graying with an A. That's patreon.com/graying rainbows.
I really didn't have a gay practice at all. Most of my practice tended towards geriatrics because I liked that sort of patient. And after a year or two, I was only accepting relatives of patients, maybe within 3 years or so, and had a good practice. And I think I didn't really have any gay patients for several years. But we, of course, met members of the gay community who were, frankly, considered that thought of us as wild-eyed liberals from San Francisco. And there were a couple of people who were afraid to even be seen parking in our driveway, even though it was on this sort of country road. I mean, we had our own well, we had electricity, of course, but it wasn't like someone would be too likely to drive by there. We did have someone throw eggs at the house the second year or so at one point at Halloween or something, but I didn't think we were, again, it was low key. And Connecticut, when we moved there, they had repealed the sodomy law in 1971. So we moved there in 78, but they didn't really have civil unions or anything to weigh in. The 2005 was the first legal civil union in Connecticut. We gradually got to know people, and we had like this big 4th of July party. We had a pool and people would come there. We warned his sister, don't let your nieces come up. They lived down the street from us on the other side of his mother when we're having this party, and there'd be all these cars parked, and his nieces were still pretty young at that point, but still it was obviously we were having a party and they weren't invited, and his mother, when our house was built, it was built adjacent, just down the street from his mother and niece. His mother had this 50 acres of land, and they cut off a lot for us, and that's why we built our house there. Alan came out to her as far as our relation before we moved back to Connecticut, of course. So, and she was comfortable. She really liked me, and she she said, because he's 10 years older, she said, did you lead him astray? She was concerned that he had seduced me or something. I said, oh, no. We had this discussion. And, I always got along very well with her and his sister and brother-in-law. And then again, the nieces were too young to really have a discussion of that. So we went on for a while that way. And then I had maybe a couple patients. I had a couple gay men who came to me because they wanted to be treated for STDs. Sure enough, they had their own doctors, but they didn't want to tell their doctors they were gay. So they came to me because they had heard I was a gay physician and just wanted me to treat their STD. And I wasn't too happy about that, to tell you the truth. I felt that was not the appropriate use of my skills. On the other hand, I treated them, of course. And actually, I became involved with a gay health collective in Hartford, which was about 45 minutes drive away, the capital of Connecticut, a gay health collective, because there was a need for gay men and women to be treated by someone who was comfortable, that was gay. And so this collective formed, and I was the only physician involved with it initially, and opened a clinic. It was in one evening a week, I think, because I had my own practice. I couldn't, and I would go up there, would treat STD. There was a physician's assistant, I think a nurse, and opened the space. And also at the time, AIDS was starting to be diagnosed across the country. And it was very hard to get information on it. Actually, one of my sources of information was the New York Native, which was a gay publication out of New York City. And there was this physician's assistant in Illinois, I think, who would put out this newsletter. And you read things from these different sources about this gay-related immune disease. And it was very hard to find stuff in the medical literature about it, basically. At first, gay men or men who in the health professions were trying to find out all they could about it, because obviously it was impacting their community and could possibly impact themselves. And again, this was before the internet really was going. I think there was email finally, but we would try to get all the information we could and then share it. And so this collective also did stuff along those lines. Eventually, a gay physicians group formed in San Francisco, and I sort of got some information from them too. We didn't have any group of gay physicians in Connecticut, although ultimately we did find each other and formed a small group. I was the only gay physician in Eastern Connecticut, east of the Connecticut River. The rest were more in urban areas like Hartford and New Haven. And we had periodic meetings for a while because, again, we felt so isolated. And that was helpful from a support standpoint. And then I got a young man called me who had HIV. And he wasn't a patient. And he'd heard I was a gay physician and he had symptoms. And at that point, they had a blood test, but there wasn't any treatment. It was even before Retrovir was available. And it turned out he was living with his mother and grandfather in I think a duplex. And he had a lover, but who wasn't living with him. But I think he was friends with the family. They were aware of the relationship. And he was also a type 1 insulin-dependent diabetic. And so shortly after he came to see me, he had to be hospitalized. It was like unbelievable. Food trays were left outside the door. Everybody was in all this protective equipment. It was like a whole different world. No one wanted to be near him. None of the specialists. There wasn't an ID specialist who was a real idiot. He was very redneck, as it turned out. I just felt like I had to be the doctor for this guy. I had to be the infectious disease specialist. I had to be everything because there was no support group at that time. There was nothing, really. And he, unfortunately, because of his diabetes and all, he went downhill pretty quickly. I think he survived that hospitalization, but he was gone within a few months. And then I get this call from the local newspaper because I wrote AIDS on his death certificate that we understand you had a patient that died of AIDS, and turns out he worked as a maintenance person at a local elementary school, and they wanted to make a big deal of this. Because by then people were there was all this fear about contagion, et cetera. And I said, look, I'm going to sue you if you publicize anything. This is, unfortunately, death certificates were a matter of public record, but I said, you create a panic. It's just totally irresponsible for you to publicize this. And so they didn't. They ended up not printing an article about it. And I was afraid his mother and grandfather didn't. They were renters. and that it also they might be kicked out by their landlord, et cetera. So it was really a time when people were very discriminated against, Ryan White, the whole. And then a neighbor down the street who was my patient, a nurse, had a heart valve replacement because she had rheumatic heart disease. And as a result of the transfusion she had for that, became positive. And she worked for a pediatrician, a very well-respected pediatrician in our community. And she came to me. I've forgotten if she was a patient before that or if she came to me because she knew that I had treated a couple of AIDS patients at that point, and said, "What should I do?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't feel she was a risk to the practice, but she did draw blood on occasion." I said, "No, I think you have to share it with him anyway, just so he's aware." And he fired her. The pediatrician fired her. I was just so distraught about that. And she was really worried about her husband losing his job if anyone found out that he worked with, and she had a teenage son. And it's just, all those social issues. And she was a good friend of my partner's sister, actually, but she didn't tell her about it. But it's like all those issues. In the meantime, we were starting to see more HIV positive patients coming to the emergency room. And I'd been on the medical, so I was a senior member by that point. I'd been there for several years and well respected. And I was appointed to the medical board. And I was, I think, secretary of the board at that point. And a patient came to me, another patient, who was scheduled to have elective knee surgery. And he wanted to know if he should tell the doctor that he was positive. He was HIV positive, but asymptomatic, and looked in good health, of course. And I said, whoa, I'd already had this experience with the nurse being fired and everything. And I said, well, I felt really conflicted. I felt the doctor, it was not major surgery, but the doctor should be aware to be extra cautious. It was in the days when people weren't always that careful about protection against infectious diseases in many ways. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll bring it up at one of our medical board meetings that I had these conflicts about the ethics of, not telling this other physician, but on the other hand, of betraying a patient confidence. And I hadn't referred the patient to that physician. He already had the consultation and was going to be having this surgery. And so at a medical board meeting, I brought it up. And I wasn't openly gay at that point, but I assumed several people knew, and it had never been an issue, I didn't think. And I hadn't really had a discussion with my two partners in my practice knew I didn't have a gay practice as such, And so I said, look, I have this patient who's seen a surgeon, and I feel uncomfortable betraying his confidentiality, but I also feel uncomfortable about this. And the surgeons on the medical board were outraged that I would consider not divulging it to them. And they were just outraged, And I said, well, it's an ethical dilemma, and they couldn't seem to see that. So it wasn't resolved at that meeting. And then like a week or two later, I hear that I'm going to have to appear before this other board of the hospital that wasn't the medical board. It was some super higher board that had members of the community, non-physicians on it and all that. It was more of a higher up board anyway. And I mentioned it to this emergency room physician I knew, and he said, the last time someone got called before that board, they lost their privileges. I said, what? And I did some research and tried to find some medical stuff. There wasn't at that point there weren't any ethical guidelines that had been published about HIV positive patients specifically. It was really the early ages of HIV. And so I tried to get what I could. I distributed this article that had been in some two articles. One was in the gay press about this dentist who had been positive and some patients that he had and the ethics of the whole thing, and this other thing, and showing that it was becoming more common in the heterosexual community, et cetera, and that, you needed some guidelines and stuff, and but try to show the ethical issues. And I appeared before this board, and they had read the stuff, and we discussed it some. And the bottom line was I kept my privileges. They didn't say it was over whether I could lose my privileges, but I am not even sure if it was right after, just before this board meeting, Yale did come out with some ethical guidelines and how Yale was sort of the closest university hospital on how it should be handled by physicians and confidentiality, et cetera, which helped calm things down. But it really left some bitter feelings on my part. And then we were starting to see more patients coming to our emergency room who were HIV positive, or just usually often will be just diagnosed because they presented with opportunistic infection or whatever. And the majority of them were drug using people, of course. And our policy then was, as I said, we were in the sort of call group coverage, was if you were on call, you'd have to take emergency room call a couple times a month, maybe. It would rotate among the primary care providers for a medical call. And we had emergency room staff, but we didn't have house staff. This was a community hospital. So if someone had to be admitted from the emergency room for a medical reason, you would take that patient. And I started getting calls when then someone would come who was an IV drug user. When I wasn't on call, someone else was on call, and they'd want me to take the patient. And I wasn't an infectious disease guy. I was a primary care internist. And I said, well, wait a minute, I'm not on call for the emergency room tonight. Oh, but Dr. So-and-so thought you'd be better suited to take care of this patient than he would be. And I said, wait a minute. And as I say, our infectious disease consultant, I'm not sure if he was, I guess he was in private practice too, his infectious disease person, but wasn't doing general and primary care, was happy to consult on those patients, but he didn't want to take them as his own patients, basically. And I said, wait a minute, if the other primary care people have to get comfortable with this, and I'm happy to, if they want someone else to give them some information other than this ID person who I guess he was competent, but he was very discriminating. I mean, his attitude towards IV drug users or gays was very redneck and very not good at all. I said, I'd be happy to sidewalk counsel some things, but I don't want to become the HIV doctor for the hospital. It's not my specialty. It's not my practice. If there's a gay person, I will take them, even if I'm not on call. But I'm not going to take everybody. That's not what I wanted to be. And although I was spending all this extra time in the literature doing everything I could to be as informed as I could about HIV, because I didn't want to have to rely on this ID person. So that kept going this way for a while. And then on a couple of patients where I wanted to get consults, especially surgical consults, it was very hard to find people that were comfortable seeing HIV positive patients. And it created a lot of bad feelings with me. Then this doctor on the staff started spreading a rumor that I was going to go into HIV medicine and research, and I was going to leave my practice. How I found out was a patient came to me in tears and said, I heard you're going to stop practicing. And I said, what? Who told you that? And that's how I found out about this. And it was just really a very difficult time. I became involved in developing the Southeastern Connecticut AIDS Project because we needed support group and support for these patients, the gay ones anyway, I felt initially, that like buddy systems and all the things that started happening around the country and weren't available in our neck of the woods. And I began to think I actually thought about one point of packing up and moving to a more urban area like Boston because of the whole issue over HIV. But it gradually calmed down. People got used to it and all, but it left a lot of bitter feelings on my part towards the surgical staff. Oh, my coverage group broke up. I told you I was with two other internists, and they were straight, and they didn't have a problem with the gay issue. But when it became known that I was treating a couple, and I never had more than maybe 10 HIV positive patients in my practice at a time, but they became uncomfortable that then they were going to be regarded as, I don't know, people knew they weren't gay, but I mean, it was incredible. Suddenly all this homophobia came out that I didn't expect. So our coverage group for a while was just covering on my own, which is very hard because you're on call all the time. I mean, I was only on emergency room call a couple days a month, but you're on call every night. You can't go away. You can't, So I was really, I finally did work out a coverage arrangement with a couple other younger physicians on the staff who were sort of new, but it just was a very terrible time. And then on the 25th anniversary of Stonewall, I went to this conference in New York after I did have some coverage, and it was a gay health conference, not physicians per se, but some physicians were there. And this fellow was recruiting for community health center on the Cape that in Provincetown in Wellfleet. He was gay and he was the executive director. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know from Alabama if you ever heard of it, but it's a gay resort area. I mean, it's a resort area for all sorts of people, but very artistic oriented, et cetera. And it has a huge gay population in summer and some gay residents, of course, too. So this was in the 90s by then. And I said, we visited there. We talked about maybe a nice place to retire, but I hadn't really considered practicing there. And the more we thought about Alan's mother at that point had Alzheimer's, and I didn't think he'd want to move to so far away from her. I mean, it's an hour, 2 hours away from Connecticut from where we live. But we talked it over, and I ended up interviewing, and we ended up moving to the Cape after all. So that's how I ended up on the Cape. While we were still in Connecticut, the very first GLBT march on Washington was in June of '79 on the 10th anniversary of Stonewall. And we had been involved in Alan was sort of involved in some of the we didn't have gay pride parades as such in Connecticut for the most part initially, but I'd been involved with this gay health collective. We wanted to have more of a gay community there. And we were sort of frustrated that people were they would go to gay bars, but they didn't do anything else. It was a separate part of their lives. They're very closeted. And so we formed this little gay discussion group in the New London area that we would meet with. And Alan actually we developed a gay lending library and different things like that. And as I said, eventually became involved in forming a support group too. But we went to this first march on Washington in June of '79. I scheduled time off, and the two of us went to Washington, D.C. And we'd been to gay pride events in San Francisco, of course, which are huge affairs, even when we were there. And it was like wonderful to see all these gay people and to be part of that. And we really found it very positive. Although we were going to march in the Connecticut contingent, well, to show how it was all women. And I have to give women credit. Lesbians have been so much more politically active than gay men, especially in those days. Gay men were just partying and going to bars, and they didn't really. There's some pioneers like Frank Comedy and different ones that really worked for gay rights, but overall, the women did all the work in those days. I have to give them credit. And we thought, wow, we'll be the only men in this group, which is fine. But there was also this group, Gay People in Medicine, that was all gay medical students, actually, this was before we had a gay practicing physicians organization. I said, oh, let's march with them. So that's what we did. We marched with the Gay People in Medicine group. So that was the first march in Washington, June of '79. Then in October 11th, 1987 was the second march in Washington. This was after AIDS was going on. And October 11th ultimately became Coming Out Day. That was how Coming Out Day got started. This was the second national march on Washington for LGBT people. And it was the first public display of the names quilt, which I'm sure you know, but not every your listener knows. It was where people would create panels in memory of people who had died with AIDS. And it was the first public display across the nation, and it was laid out on the national before the national monument on the green there. And I marched that time. Actually, I wore with that. By that time, we had a national physicians group, American Association of Physicians for Human Rights. They've changed their name now to GLAM, a Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, since then. But I wore a doctor's coat, white coat with my name embroidered, and brought a stethoscope and marched with this group. And while we were marching, this physician jumped out of the crowd that I knew from my residency in San Francisco. He said, oh, you're still alive. And he grabbed me and said, oh, how are you? And we talked, and he had stayed in practice, and he had been a chief resident when I was in my residency at our hospital. And actually, ultimately, he joined an older straight physician's practice and developed his own practice. I don't know how much of it was a gay practice by that point, but he was, he'd seen several people die, and he knew of a couple people who trained with me who had died of AIDS. And he said, you want to come back to San Francisco and join my practice? I said, no, I'm, even despite the issues, I was, in Connecticut, and it would be a reach. And but there was this panel laid out, and they were selling posters for the NAMES Project, National AIDS Memorial. And there in the poster was a panel for this patient that I been the very first patient admitted with AIDS to our community hospital. And there was a panel, After he died, ultimately his mother and grandfather moved away, and I didn't know where. Well, they'd moved to Florida, and his mother had made this panel and submitted it. And there it was, right in the middle of this poster, a panel for him showing his date of birth and death. And I just broke down. It was incredible. It was a very moving thing anyway, but to see him on, and I bought the poster immediately, of course, and I still have it framed here. I was going to show you, but it's since we're just doing this verbally. So that was the second march. And then we finally went to a third march in April of 93, was the third march for equal rights and liberation. We went with two friends of ours, one of whom was a physician also and his partner. And so we went to all three of those. And we've made, tremendous progress since then. I ended up with the Community Health Center on the Cape where it was fine to be gay. Although when I first joined, I've forgotten there were two offices, Provincetown and Wellfleet. The Provincetown office had a gay surgeon who was doing general medicine at that point. He was the medical director, a young physician who was fairly new to practice. He had gone to school out on the West Coast, I think either Portland or Seattle in the Northwest. And he was very interested in HIV medicine. He was doing that. He'd only been at the practice a couple of years. And then a physician assistant, a couple other people there. In the Wellfleet office, there was a woman physician internist who was straight, and a nurse practitioner, and maybe one other physician there. I've forgotten exactly. It was a relatively small practice and various assorted personnel and things. And these are two community health centers, joined together. They had been separate at one point, but now we're joined. And interestingly, so for health insurance, I thought, well, finally I'll be able to get Alan on my health insurance. Well, the insurance company didn't recognize domestic partnerships at that point, and the practice wasn't big enough. So the first couple of years, he couldn't be on my health insurance, which is very expensive if you have to. He was working just part-time in the summers pretty much then because he had his real estate license, but he didn't want to do real estate on the Cape. And he was doing volunteer work with the AIDS support group in Provincetown and a couple other things, but he still had to pay pretty hefty amount for his own health insurance. Finally, after 2 years there, I think the group got big enough and the insurance company decided, they would recognize domestic partnerships. And so then he finally was able to be on my health insurance. But those are the days. People take a lot for granted these days. It's just really, it was a different world even then, and this was I think we moved there in the 90s. Let me see. I think January 1995 was when I joined that practice. So this was not the Middle Ages, but even then, insurance companies weren't recognizing gay relationships. You couldn't marry legally at that point. Finally, I think Vermont was the first to start having civil unions that were recognized. It was like, these are the old days. We've come a tremendous way. Much as I complain about some things, we have made strides. And there was a silver lining to AIDS in that people who were prominent did end up being either outed or coming out. And I think people became much more aware of what was going on. When the first move came along about making gay marriage legal, I thought, that's a bad decision because it's not worth fighting for at this point. Equal rights, but marriage is too toxic a term. It'll offend a lot of people that are very religious about this whole thing. But ultimately, it worked out. And again, we've come a long ways.
Larry, do you mind talking a little bit more about what was going on during AIDS? Because, you gave us a very good snapshot of that very beginning when everyone was so afraid. And I remember it because I was actually in medical school when it started. And I can remember my own fear at one point when I stuck myself with a scalpel with somebody that I knew was positive back at the time when there was no treatment. I guess you probably went through a pretty bad period that you didn't refer to when it felt like we just were watching these people die.
A lot of people could be out and small, very small. Even, this coming out date, for instance, I mentioned October 11th is now coming out day. Alan and I are from some older generation. Would we feel, even in San Francisco, we were sort of uncomfortable, accepted in a gay group or something, holding hands or being very demonstrative in public? It depends on your age and time and how you feel. When I was in medical school, turns out there was a faculty member that had given a lecture that I attended, and sort of, he was a pathologist by training, actually. And I ran into him in a Rochester bar. By then I was old enough to go to a bar in one summer when I was home on summer vacation, and said, oh, hi. And he said, do you know me? And I said, yeah, you're Dr. So-and-so. And he said, he left within a couple minutes, he was shocked and then I ran into him another time, like in an airport or something at one point. And then finally, the third time I ran into him, and I don't remember, I think it was again a sort of a public setting, but not. He said, oh, I have to apologize for running away before. I'm not out in this community and everything. And and he was a single person. He must have been, so I was in medical school, he must have been in his 40s or 50s at that point. So again, it was a whole different world. And his mother was still living. He didn't live with her, but it's like a Jewish boy. I don't think he'd ever been married or anything, but it was a whole different time as far as all that. And I have to admit, we were a little less tolerant with people who married just to fool the family and everything. I realized that some people didn't know and some people weren't. I was always amazed there how some people could not be aware of their sexuality. It depends. I mean, it's like bisexuality. I think most of what I've read in the literature, it's much more common for women to be ambisexual or bisexual, whereas men generally don't fall in the middle of the spectrum. They're pretty much to one side or the other fairly definitely, even though they may not realize it themselves till later. And like I'm a strict Kinsey 6. I've never had sex with a woman. I've never really had sexual feelings with them. I can appreciate women as being beautiful and like them for their non-sexual qualities and all, but that's me. And then we were lucky on our families. I mean, his mother, he wasn't sure how she would take. I mean, he'd been with another partner for several years, and there's sort of his roommates and things, and his mother, he wasn't sure how she would take the whole thing. But she, obviously people start suspecting after a certain length of time on all that. And my family, they said my father, we had this one sort of discussion when I was in college, I guess. And then we never really discussed it after that, although I assume that he assumed I was still I think I presented as being bisexual at the time, although I'd never had any sexual experiences with women, and he hadn't seen me dating anybody. So even in San Francisco, the gay physicians I ran into there were generally, unless they had a gay practice, were closeted, and it just was a different time completely. And finally, there were more things published in the literature, both straight. I don't remember what year the American Psychiatric Association decided that we were no longer pathological as far as homosexuality, but it happened somewhere along the line in there, but well before the civil rights legislation. But
yeah, it was 1973.
73 was the year that they made that decision?
Yeah.
Okay, so
I guess that would have been DSM 3.
So that's while I was in medical school then, actually, because I graduated in 75 from medical school. It's funny, they did have a human sexuality course at our medical school. This is Buffalo. That was elective, and everybody who took it didn't need to take it. It was the ones who didn't take it who needed to take it, And I think it might have been someone who was involved in that course that was the one where I broached the topic of, well, could I be openly gay going to applying for internships or residencies? And they said, absolutely not. Don't consider it. And there weren't any gay student groups. There might have been. I don't even think there was necessarily University of Buffalo, whether they had an undergraduate student group at that point. They were starting to crop up in different places. Haverford didn't have an openly gay group when I was there, obviously. I think Penn did, but I only learned about it sort of after the fact. And again, to go into the downtown Philadelphia and do something was not easy, even though there were trains.
Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to share? Words of wisdom for those who are earlier on this journey than you obviously are?
Well, I would say coming out, I think it has to be a personal decision, but almost everyone who decides to do that is happy they did it. And it's like that physician from England you interviewed. I did listen to that interview, who was married and had kids and came out then fairly late, and how gratified he was by the reception he got. And I think that today, especially, I don't know about young people. I read about people coming out in junior high and high school, and And that's still when they're still dependent on their parents and everything. And people used to be thrown out of their families all the time. And
They still are.
it still showed that a lot of the homeless youth, certainly the ones who are gay or lesbian, were kicked out. That's how they ended up being homeless for the most part. So that's still happening today, unfortunately. And so I'd say, despite what you see on the internet, be very circumspect about how you handle that till you're emancipated, because you may be emancipated prematurely. And the good thing is, like Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, there are lots of organizations that maybe could help your parents cope. And I think you recommended that organization, something I heard too. I've never been personally involved with it, but I certainly have recommended it to a number of people. And there are certainly online support groups these days. So, I mean, it's still even a concern today. Here's my partner has Lewy body disease and dementia and Parkinson's. And I still worry about the possibility of discrimination in a nursing home setting or from even in other medical settings. We have a primary care, and actually he's a GP, but he's very with it, who knows our situation, is comfortable with it and all. But it's not, even today, there can be discrimination. And it's always in the back of your mind, how do I handle the situation? And what do I disclose? And what's the reception we'll get? But overall, I think it's generally, if you can do it, please.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share?
That covers it pretty well. It's really, again, I looking back, I've been lucky in life, and you're lucky to meet someone who I know that there's some luck involved, always meeting the right person and being together. And I was just very fortunate to meet the man I met, and we're still here, and it can happen. And so don't give up. And you can have bad experiences. Certainly, you meet people that you wouldn't want to spend your life with too, but there are good people out there. And you have to try some too. You have to put some work into it as well. It's not a one-way street.
I want to thank Dr. Larry Millhoffer for taking the time to share his story. For those of us who may be new to the community, it's important to remember how devastating the AIDS epidemic was. It literally wiped out a generation of gay men and created something of a generation gap. Many lost everyone they loved, but their losses were not even publicly acknowledged. Larry also reminds us that being out was very dangerous. Most people of his generation were only out to a few close friends. I think it's very important that people of all ages understand what earlier generations experienced. If you grew up in a time when everyone was in the closet, it adds another level of challenge to coming out, both to yourself and those around you. As always, you will find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com, and you can subscribe for free wherever you listen to podcasts. You can get show notes automatically via our newsletter. Just text Graying Rainbows, all one word, to 33777, spell graying with an A, or look for the link in the show notes. Before I close, I want to talk about our private group on MeWe. We moved a while back for better privacy for those who need it. Membership is by invitation, but all you have to do is send me an email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. And I also want to remind you that if you've joined the group, it's important to post, because it's a vicious circle if new members come by and there's nothing happening. If you don't want to post something personal, just post a comment about the latest episode. Again, I want to thank those of you who are supporting Graying Rainbows via Patreon at patreon.com/Graying Rainbows. You can also support my work by buying my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, from your favorite online bookstore or at brainsciencepodcast.com. Of course, I hope you will be sharing Graying Rainbows with others. I'll be back soon with another interview, but until then, check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Graying Rainbows is copyright 2021 to Dr. Virginia Campbell. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.